The last couple of weeks, we've had our summer children's program. Last week, this is not from it, by the way. This is one of Chewy's toys. Last week, we had the children's program in Ponoka. The week before, it was here in Bashaw. This year, it was called Wonderfully Made. It's just a morning each day, and we tell a story. We sing some songs. We talk about the story, whatever the theme of the day is. We play some games. We do a craft. We have an absolutely outrageously amazing snack, and it's good. It's a good time. The kids have a lot of fun. It's a little bit different between Bashaw and Ponoka. It's a little bit different for a lot of reasons. We use essentially the same program, but very much like a Sunday morning, it depends on where it's happening, doesn't it? And one of the unique things that happened this year was that here in Bashaw, most of the kids, I think almost all of the kids, were between like 5 and 7 years old. And in Ponoka, the majority of them were like 10 to 12. There was a few that were 5 to 7, but the majority of them were sort of 10 to 12 years old. That is a very different dynamic. A very different dynamic. But both were really great programs, and we had lots of great help, and I think it was really successful. So each day we tell a story, and two of the stories were from this, which is a completely real and legitimate thing that I did not create, the Big Instruction Book for Loving Everyone. Bible. And it doesn't matter whether you're 5 to 7 years old or 10 to 12 years old. When someone holds this up in front of you and goes, this is a completely real and legitimate thing called the Big Instruction Book for Loving Everyone, they go, no, it's not. You made that up. And yes, I did. But it is nonetheless true that the Bible is, in fact, a big instruction book for loving everyone. We told two stories. So basically what it is I try and retell a story from the Bible in a little bit more, let's call it, creative way. And one of the stories last week was this, our theme was sort of creation and then how we are wonderfully made, not only for creating, but for creation, right? So our relationship with, we're created, and then our relationship with the animals, our relationship with the earth, our relationship with each other, our relationship with God, right? That was the, relationship with the earth, then the animals, the people, and then God. So it was essentially the way the creation story rolls out, in fact. The second day, I told this story about how the creation story says that God created in 6 days and then rested on the seventh day, and then on the eighth day, God called a meeting. I figured church people would get that. And the meeting was to bring all of creation to the great big rock. Imagine Pride Rock from Lion King, because that's totally what I stole the idea from. Was inspired by. So everyone comes to the rock, and then God tells them that they are connected to this rock on which they live, and that God is in the rock, and that the power of creation and the energy of all things is in the rock. And all of them, of course, immediately interpret the rock as meaning the rock that they all just came to, not the earth, except for the unicorn, who asks questions. And the unicorn asks a lot of questions, and it annoys all the other animals, and so on and so on. The point is, the unicorn asks questions, and God keeps saying, that's a great question. It's great that you ask questions, and no one else does. And there's a point at which God says, do you understand what I'm talking about? And they all go, yes. But God knows, no, they don't. So Jesus teaches with a lot of parables. And in the 13th chapter of Matthew's gospel, it's essentially all parables, right? It's the parable of the sower, the parable of the weeds and the wheat, which we talked about last week. And then there's this bunch of parables. But the reason why you heard it's these verses and these verses is because Matthew lays it out differently. Matthew goes, big parable of the sower, some little parables, big parable of the weeds, a few more parables, and then this bit at the end where Jesus says, after all of these parables, Do you understand? And the disciples all go, yes. If that's true, either all the disciples are super intelligent and wise, and we are stupid, or we've been wasting a lot of time talking about the parables, because we spend a lot of time talking about what these parables mean. And we should, because parables aren't just simple stories with a simple point. It's fine if you want to hear them that way, but the fact is, invariably, if you start to take them apart a little bit, as you deconstruct them, you find you have many more questions about what the point of this parable is, and many more thoughts about what Jesus could mean. And a really obvious example is the one that is probably most famous of all of those, short little 2-sentence parables, the mustard seed. Absolutely. It's about how a little thing can turn into something huge. Except, the mustard seed is not the tiniest of seeds. There are many seeds smaller than the mustard seed. So why did Jesus say that? Did he not know that there are seeds that are smaller? Or was there a reason why he specifically used the mustard seed? Might that reason that he specifically used the mustard seed to make his point wasn't just that it's a tiny seed that grows into something big, but that in fact a mustard is a weed? That could be. What about the fact that he says it grows into a big bush and eventually a tree that birds can nest in? Nope, it does not. Either Jesus doesn't know his farming, or he knows, but there's a reason why he told it that way. Because it doesn't. It's a weed, and it grows quite big. It can grow quite big, but it certainly doesn't grow into a tree. And yes, you might intentionally plant it. It's still a weed. You might intentionally plant it because mustard can be used for a variety of things, can't it? It's not just a spice thing. It can also be used to create, has a healing use, right? It can also be used to create extremely destructive things that can hurt you. Interesting choice. In fact, other people who've done different translations, The Message, for instance, Eugene Peterson, when he tells this part of the story, he says Jesus said an acorn, which is a lovely contemporary image that we'll all get because we've seen acorns and oak trees. Except, oak trees aren't weeds. And they're also not destructive, potentially. They're also not harsh and bitter. What about all those other things? And what about the thing that we never ever talk about? Particularly because most contemporary Christians, preachers, like to use this as an image for the church, right? From planting a small seed. Oh, it has to be planted. Yep, there's another thing. From planting a small seed can come this great thing, this great thing that was slightly cynical that we call the church. Except, Jesus would never have thought of it that way. I cannot imagine. But even if he did, let's bear in mind the essential thing in this story that we never talk about. The seed has to be planted. It has to be nurtured. It has to be fed and watered. Yes, absolutely. But eventually, the mustard dies. It has a life cycle. It dies and then leaves seed so that other can grow, right? Like most things, like all things, it has a life cycle. It's great to say this is an image of how from planting a small seed something great can come, but the image that Jesus is using is something that eventually dies in order that something new may grow. So if you're going to use this as an image for the church, and not just the kingdom of heaven, you must be willing to acknowledge that things have to die in order that something new can begin. So what about all that? Do you think when Jesus told these parables, And remember, by the way, let me just also throw into the mix here, just to completely confuse everything further. Last week I was talking about how most biblical scholars agree that the explanations for the parable of the sower and the parable of the weeds and the grain that Jesus gives in Matthew's gospel were not actually Jesus. They were added by the author of the Gospel of Matthew or someone later, because Jesus never explained parables. So when he asks the disciples if they understand everything and they go, yes, what do you think? Do you think they understood everything? Because all we have here is essentially a collection of sayings. Either the disciples were going, yeah, sure, yeah, okay. Or there's more to this story. And the more to this story is, especially if you're 10 to 12 years old, you have questions and you have thoughts about what was just said. And you don't always put your hand up to say them, by the way. So I think this we've got this like tiny little piece of Matthew's gospel where there was a saying, and no conversation around it at all. And then Jesus asking them if they understand, and they all say yes. Well, if the parables are all that simple, why do we talk about them so much? Why do we have so many questions about them? Why do we have so much conversation about what they could possibly mean? Not just conversation, but disagreement about what they could possibly mean. There's way more to this story. And I wonder if maybe the author of the Gospel of Matthew told the story this way so that we might wonder about that and might ask our own questions, just like the disciples might have. I mean, imagine if the author of Matthew had recorded the entire conversation around this, each of these sayings. We would actually have we wouldn't need to talk about it really, we'd have this explanation. We might disagree with it, but we'd have an explanation. But instead, the author of Matthew leaves it hanging the way Jesus might have for the disciples, so that they could go, you realize that mustard is a weed, right, Jesus? Like, did you mean to imply that the kingdom of, I see where you're going with this. There would have been some conversation. So somebody trespassed on somebody else's property where he found treasure, didn't tell anyone, including the person whose property it was, and then went and bought the property so that he could acquire the treasure. That doesn't sound particularly fair, Jesus. What do you mean by that? I think Jesus' response to all of these questions, all this conversation would be, what do you think I mean by that? Sincerely, I do. Because I think Jesus told parables. The point he was trying to make with telling stories that are parables is that there are many ways to understand this story. And as long as the many ways that you might understand this story uses the lens which is Jesus, in other words, love and grace and compassion and all of those things that Jesus talks about and teaches, you can understand the parable in a way that is meaningful to you. That's kind of the point, I think. This wasn't just Jesus saying, here's what you should think. This was Jesus saying, think. Would you like to know what happens to the unicorn in the story? One of the lions thinks it's an antelope. That's why we don't have unicorns. They ask too many questions. But I think often we read these stories of Jesus and we go, yes, okay, so clearly it means this. And particularly if you're somebody who might at some point have understood the Bible literally, you can't. The moment you start to read it, the moment you start to hear it in your head, you are interpreting it right away. and you are interpreting it with your own lens. The piece that Jesus, I think, wants to teach people is that lens ought to be that you are good. In your heart of hearts, you are good because you are created in the image of God. You are part of God. You are part of all of this creation, which is God. You are part of the Spirit, which is God. You are part of whatever, all of that language that we use, you are a piece of that. You are an essential piece of that. And because you are, here's a story that you might find meaningful. And we might all find it meaningful in our own way. So it's important to wonder about it. It's important to have questions about it. It's important to not just sit there and listen to me tell you what you should think. I imagine Jesus said that a lot too. You'll notice that doesn't get reported in the Gospels either. I imagine Jesus had many very lengthy conversations. In the, I don't know how long it would take you to read one of the Gospels. It depends on, how fast you read, I suppose. But if you could read one of the Gospels in an hour, remember it's covering Jesus' entire ministry. So at least anywhere from like 3 to 4 or 5 years, right? We're not exactly sure. And remember, there's no story of Jesus before that. There's no story about Jesus' personal life. I can't imagine he didn't have one. If the point of the whole point of the story is the word becomes flesh, why wouldn't the Word want to experience the world as we experience it? Questions. Wonder. The thing is, we so often hear these stories in the Gospels, and particularly when you then start to read into Acts and, oh, bless him, Paul, this is what you should think. No, I can't imagine Jesus ever saying that. What I imagine Jesus saying is, here's some stories to help you understand what I'm trying to show you in the life that I am living, because you can live that life too. So how is this story connecting with you? Not just in anywhere around like 33, 35 AD, but now. What do these stories say to you? One of the things the story about the mustard seed says to me is, I should hear that story in the context of the fact that Jesus just told that parable moments after, or potentially hours if there was conversation. He told a parable about how the sower casts the seed everywhere. If that seed is love, that means it should go everywhere. Without consideration of where you are putting it. Because you're not interested in what the return is on your investment. What you're interested in is the love that you are giving to the world. And then moments later, here's a story about how the tiniest seed planted somewhere can turn into something huge. And it grows invasively like a weed. And it can be harsh, but it can also be healing. Does it sound like life yet? Just one way to try and hear those stories. If the lens is good, if the lens is love and kindness and grace, we can all come to those stories our own way and wonder about them ourselves. And I know this is hard. Think for ourselves. And not wonder about what someone else is telling us we ought to think. By all means, we should consider what other people think of things, particularly historians and people who study the history of the Bible and the era in which Jesus told this story, because truly that information can be very helpful. Helpful, not determining. One of the biggest things we talk about the least when we talk about Jesus, we'll talk about the love, we'll talk about the grace or the compassion, we'll talk about how Jesus lived, we'll talk about how Jesus treated people, we'll talk about how Jesus was the incarnation of love. We'll talk about all of that stuff, and we will talk so little about how Jesus just wants us to darn well think about it. So let's think about it.